How many of these sessions, when you do a session like this, how many times do you run it?
All the conversations just happen once. There's 30 different conversations happening in addition to the framing and context sessions and weekly roundups.
Got it. Thank you.
They are meant to build on each other, and that this is sort of a framing conversation, and then we move to design and then implementation. So thanks. Some of these threads, yeah, go through. Hi, team.
So sorry I'm late.
No, not at all. Well, I think we'll get started and maybe a couple more people will join as we go. But well, good morning or good afternoon or evening or whatever time it is for everyone, and thank you for joining this session. I was just saying to Suzanne that while none of the kind of specific topics of conversations repeat, a lot of we have set them up so some are framing conversations, and then we move into design and then implementation. So we're hoping that some of the kind of concepts and frames that we talked through today will sort of build on themselves later throughout the conversations. So to start, I think we want to start just with the acknowledgement and reminder that we've been doing so far all week. So if everyone can lift your hands off the keyboard so that we can see them, and now take hold of your own hand in whatever way feels comfortable. So we want to acknowledge this is not a light topic, and in this conversation, in all of these conversations, we are going to be intellectualizing and abstracting a very real set of experiences. These discussions may trigger a lot of emotions. They have in the past. And we know that in this room, statistically, there are likely survivors of gender-based violence. And we all participate in political, social, cultural, economic systems that give permission for and facilitate violence. One of the facts I was thinking about this morning is that as many as 38% of murders of women around the world are committed by an intimate partner. I think, people on the outside don't always remember how very real and deadly this issue can turn. So just let's have a brief moment of silence to acknowledge the violence happening in this moment somewhere to someone. Now, if everyone can reverse your hands in however way it felt. And notice if there's a difference, notice any differences you feel. So we've come together because we want to change energy, create new possibilities to address the epidemic of violence. And we hope, the hope of Convergence is that we are connected in new ways that enable us to do even more. So let us begin. So this conversation is about seeing opportunity and risk from a survivor lens. The thing that we really want to dig into this conversation is, is to kind of get into what is a lens. We use that term a lot. We use it in justice work. We use it in finance in very specific ways. But what does that mean? How do we think about a lens? What does it mean to see the world, different systems through a lens? What is a survivor lens? And if we saw through a survivor lens, what would we see differently? What kind of daily interactions, what systems, what institutions would we see differently? We want to look at how is a survivor lens distinct from a gender-based violence lens? How is it distinct from a gender lens? What is this lens, and how might it be applied to finance, and what would be the implications if it were applied to finance? So those are the big questions we want to get into over the course of this conversation. And so just starting out with an introductory question. if we could, so we've been doing them in the chat up to now, but I think we're a small enough group that it would be great to just go around and talk it through. So if everyone, and I'll drop it in the chat as well, but if we can, if everyone can just name, you know, what element of finance or gender work or GBV work do you do? And what is the one thing about your field that most surprises people who aren't involved in it? So I'm just gonna.
I dropped it in too.
Anybody? Yeah, go for it.
I'm Sarah, involved in direct service work with survivors in South Asia.
Mhm.
And what surprises people is I work with survivors of extreme forms of gender violence, like child trafficking and, you know, complicated gang rape and things. And what surprises people is that the survivors' level of recovery is so high, and that even after experiencing these horrific things, that their capacity for joy and ability to take leadership is so much more than I expected, and that anyone, I think, typically expects.
My name is East Okech. I work with Kenya Female Advice Organization, and the work that we do is looking at money, resourcing for the survivors to actually then engage and continue their lives after the gender-based violence faced. What surprises, I think, people most is that we look at it from an intersectional and intergenerational lens. In the intersectionality, we look at how to engage on the survivors of gender-based violence from not from an heteronormative point of view, but a point of view where we are looking at also questioning that when you have
I think we lost Easter.
Oh.
No, she was having connection issues, so maybe we can.
be perpetrators of violence against women, and then we keep quiet. So my questioning is that is what I'm very loud about. I say a perpetrator is a perpetrator regardless of your gender.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of how you identify yourself, you're a perpetrator. But the question which then surprises us, or me particularly, is that we are very silent, particularly in certain regions, of the perpetration of violence by women who have sex with women against one another. Then we all come together and keep quiet about it. Yet if the perpetrator is a male perpetrator, then we are all over about it. So for me, part of my questioning and the budgeting is to say that gender-based violence is gender-based violence regardless of the gender binaries. So questioning the gender binaries of gender-based violence to ensure that we are actually speaking about gender-based violence regardless of the assigned sexual, the assigned sex of the person at birth. So those are the things which we are looking at, and ensuring that we speak up about it and speak about it very loudly. So that is what surprises many people.
Yeah.
I'm going to go around the whole room. Would anyone like to jump in next?
Okay, I'll go next. My name is Mary. I work on gender justice in a Protestant denomination in the US. And my work is really about the cultural religious mindset that allows patriarchy and sexism from an intersectional manifestation to continue. And what surprises people, I think, is that quite ancient beliefs continue to have significant force in our religious beliefs and in our cultural ideals about people based on sex and gender. They think that they're free of the past.
Hmm.
Thank you. My name is Shadrach. I work with Ability Africa Foundation in Kenya. We work with women, and our focus is working with women with disabilities, most of whom are doing businesses. And again, we interact a lot in terms of addressing gender-based violence issues which are facing the women with disabilities in Kenya. And we really realize that there are a lot of underlying issues, challenges, and atrocities that are faced by women with disabilities. What is really surprising is that the social norms and the cultural dynamics are really bent in terms of kind of derailing or weighing down the rights of women with disabilities. And therefore, in the long run, we realize that women with disabilities are facing double atrocities or double violence in terms of the social norms where they are living, and also the cultural beliefs, because there are a lot of stigma associated with disability. So this coupled with the incidences of gender-based violence, then it becomes very surprising, and it's an issue that is kind of a flagship in terms of our interventions. Thank you.
I'm happy to go next. So Teen Ward with Rockflower, which is a venture philanthropy fund, and we work through a 5-key framework of education, access to food and water, maternal and reproductive health, peace and security, and economic empowerment. And obviously, gender-based violence affects, all 5 of those keys. And I think, so my role is to get whatever money we can out to grassroots organizations and social entrepreneurs. I think the most surprising thing is how little money it takes sometimes. I'll give you an example. We're working with a grassroots group in Liberia at the moment, and the levels of rape and violence against women, children, and babies at the moment is through the roof. And this group, for a tiny amount of money, is mobilizing themselves and connecting with each other and figuring out, even if it's just through posters or through communication, but doing something. So I think that's the surprising key is, for relatively tiny amounts of money, you can have some kind of proactive sense of what to do about it.
Suzanne, Karen, Debbie?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. So my work is in gender finance, and I'm a field builder, a consultant, and a researcher on kind of the globally what's happening in gender lens investing. And that means investing to really have a positive effect on the lives of women and girls, or I think seeing gender patterns in anything that you would invest in. And for people that are not involved in it, I think one thing is people are surprised that you can use finance as a tool for social change, and that there are investors who want to be doing that and are doing that today, like Tina, like Teen and myself and others that might be on this call. And that in this conversation, that you can actually think about where gender-based violence shows up as a theme in investment. But there are many, many things about my work that surprises people, that it can be, you don't have to be a billionaire to be an investor with impact, that you can be, as Teen said, whether you have $100 or $100 million, and whether you own a bank or you have a piggy bank, as my girlfriend Tracy Gray says, you can make impact. And that there are not only women that are really committed around this, but also increasingly a base of men. And that I think people think, oh, it must always mean investing in women entrepreneurs, or some people may think, oh, it's only about investing in companies that have women on their board, when the reality is that it is a very sophisticated, differentiated arena where you can look at any theme, any sector, any place where capital is moving, and see where gender patterns play out, and see where you might be able to have a positive impact by being more intentional about what you're aiming for, and then how you measure it and how you work on it to hold people accountable and to really make a difference. So I'm sure there are many other things I could share, but I'll leave it there.
Hey everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. Excited for the conversation. My name is Devin. I'm a senior consultant and project manager at META. And META does a mix of its own investments and economic development programming in the Global South, much of which is done with a gender lens. And I think like something that's coming to mind in terms of the question that was posed is, you know, even for quite a bit of my work involves like engaging impact investment funds and businesses around looking at their models and their investment strategies through a gender lens, sometimes touching on gender-based violence or sexual harassment. But there's still, even for those investors, again, this is from, I guess, an emerging markets perspective, or one fund I'm thinking about in Africa that we work with, there's still this kind of assumption that as soon as we start to talk about impact, there is a lack of relationship to the financial performance, or a lack of understanding and materiality. And so it consistently is something that I work on and try to sensitize executives on, to see the interconnection of how their investments do have these kinds of impacts, and how those also, what's out in society and social norms and the regulatory environment impacts their investments. So very complex stuff, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Karen, you came off mute?
I was trying to. Hi, I'm Karen McLaughlin. I do some work for the International Organization for Victim Assistance, and I am currently working on the program to combat human trafficking. And in my prior life, I worked a lot with Sarah, who I was so delighted to see here at Convergence this year. So I want to ditto what she said about resiliency. What I was thinking about in terms of surprising, and what people often have a question to the tendency to question as a result of any kind of dialogue with them, is how broad and international and how broad a economic and deep in economic issue human trafficking is, and that it's the second largest organized crime in the world. And I think people have really very little understanding and are surprised at the economic impact on its victims. So I think overall that's one big theme. And I think people are very, very surprised at how often there's levels and levels of complicity or corruption or engagement of other people who they may be very surprised about. So that we have a lot of other additional things besides the perpetrators, things to tackle, and that the social norms are not always in our favor. So in dialogue with people, I think they come away with a different sense of the scale of things and how many people it would take to help even one survivor.
I can jump in with one of mine. So you all know I work at Criterion, the kind of intersection of gender-based violence and finance. And I think one of the, we're always trying to kind of bridge these worlds and I think maybe Devin said it, kind of illustrate the kind of materiality of things like gender-based violence to financial decision making. And one of the facts that always really takes people by surprise, and to me kind of illustrates the different systems that we're trying to make more together, is the fact that violence against women is a better predictor of state stability than traditional measures like the strength of democratic institutions, wealth, etc. We have research showing that actually, violence against women is actually a better predictor of that, which is kind of, I think, is not at all a common a part of the assumptions in economics and development, or, risk assessments in finance, and is I think kind of very significant. And actually, to Easter's point as well, if you're thinking about gender more, to actually think about how gender operates, not just speaking about women, but how gender operates in the world in terms of kind of power and oppression. Criterion has recently put out a paper about investing in LGBTIQ plus populations. And there's research showing that oppression of LGBTIQ individuals is actually also correlated with macro level economic outcomes. So, I mean, that seems to me, all of these things are connected, right? How you treat the most vulnerable in your society, whether it's women, whether it's LGBTIQ people, it's correlated with the kind of most fundamental systems that are relevant to finance, to business, to government, to everything. And I think it really surprises people when you can put that in front of them and say these things are not operating separate of each other.
You can go next, unless Kalia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, it's just really early here. I mean, the thing that comes up when you ask the question about surprising, it's really I'm a survivor of financial abuse, and when I interacted with the system, nobody thought it was that bad. And I was like, at least when I have been in situations where I've been hit, I knew I was going to get hit. And the financial abuse was really profound and life-changing in ways that no one wanted to acknowledge. So I think like the experience of violence is multidimensional, and it's not just one thing. Anyways, and I work in the tech industry. I'm working on building a new layer of the internet. Anyways, I'll be more awake the next call.
Thank you, Kalia. I'm Christina, also at Criterion. I think one thing that feels really relevant and also very surprising to a lot of people is the documented cost of domestic violence on companies. So not just if it's happening in the workplace, but if it happens in the home, it has a huge cost to companies' productivity, absenteeism. You can show up and not be fully present. The company has to pay more in healthcare costs and all of these things that add up. And it surprises people that something that's going on in the home can actually impact a business in that way, but it's hopeful to have all of the data that's been coming out from the IFC and other places, because it's making companies more aware of what they can do for survivors and the role they have to play in prevention.
I'll just do a quick intro. I'm LD, stands for Laura Denham. I neither work in finance nor GBV until now. Ironically, probably 15 years ago, I worked in structured finance in England and derivatives, but then quite quickly moved to producing purpose-driven events and experiences. So The surprising nature of my work is that you can be someone who loves bringing people together, love numbers, and also be passionate about cause. You can be many things. And I'm grateful to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thank you all. As we jump into the conversation, as Tia said, part of what we want to do is just talk about, you know, at a grounding level, what is a lens? And I'd love to open that and put that to the group. What does a lens mean to you? What does it help you accomplish? How do you use a lens in different ways? Suzanne, I see you come off mute.
Well, for me, it's to help you see, right? So if I use, I just got myself a new pair of glasses because I realized my regular glasses are progressives, and so I can see close and read, or I can see far. But I realized that all my calls on Zoom are this distance, and there's actually glasses that are right for that distance. And it just made me think about, you know, when you have the right lenses, you can see things more clearly. And they might have been there the whole time, but you just weren't able to see them. Things that were fuzzy become less fuzzy. It doesn't mean that you are only seeing those things. It doesn't mean that you're not seeing other things. It's just a way of sharpening your vision. And in investment, it's really important to be able to sharpen your vision.
I agree. And in addition to that, it can change what you see. So if you put a magnifying lens and maybe see certain things much bigger, or, you know, a smaller lens, and then you're not going to see some things. So a lens could be negative in terms of not seeing some things you need to see, or you could put a colored lens in and, you know, and actually just sort of shift the way that you look at things, and things will look really, really different. So I think it's important, like a lens, we talk about gender lens, and that's really positive, but you could also have like a racist lens, or, you know, a lens that isn't seeing women as important, or whatever it is. It can change what you see, as well as being able to help you see clearly. And in a good way too, like you focus in on something that you know, using a certain type of lens, like just like someone was saying, that the financial impact of domestic violence.
I think to Suzanne's point about sight, I wear contact lenses, then I have to put glasses on top of my contact lenses to be able to do computer work or read or whatever. And if you think about in the optician, you know, when they figure out your vision, they're slotting all these different lenses in one after another in that machine. And so that's how I always tend to think of lenses. Which are the individual lenses that you've got in, you know, you might have 10 lenses at the same time, but the whole point is they're trying to show you that, you know, how are you going to get the holistic vision, where you can feel and see everything, even if you don't need to look at it separately. To Suzanne's point, that, you know, you have this sense of, I'm focusing on one or two things at the same time, but the whole point is you're slotting in those lenses just so that you can kind of wrap your arms around the whole thing.
For me, I'm looking at one, removing an homogeneous way of engaging, because in terms of the homogeneity of how we engage, is that sometimes you use a lens which is in a way looking at the prism from a certain space. So we look at the North-South experience, for example. What can happen, the lens which you use for certain things which happen in the North is not exactly the same lens of what you use with what is happening within the South. So from an African feminist point of view, is that how do we then remove the lens where we think that the effects of gender-based violence is a very homogeneous way, and look at the thinking of the lens from the survivor's point of view. Because when we think of what the survivor actually needs, sometimes we tend to push agendas to the survivor instead of giving the survivors a space to actually pull what we need. So one of the things which this is bringing for me is that how do we work with the survivor so that we pull what their needs are, instead of having this log frame filling the box thing, which then ensures that we are always just pushing ideas and agendas to the survivor. There are certain things on the issue of addressing these particular issues where we want to look at how do we then address something which, for example, currently where we are working with survivors of, particularly during COVID, of sexual violence against adolescents, for example. It will be a very different way of looking at a survivor of from a married woman, for example, or from someone who is of a different gender identity, for example. So for me, in terms of those different lenses, we need to start removing the homogeneity and then look at the context of where the things come from, where the people come from, the people we are engaging with, so that it's their voice about what they need, instead of always pushing certain things about this is the framing, this is all those kind of things. So we need to start changing the frame and start saying that it can work in this way, but what is more holistic, for example, for those particular people who actually need the support. So for me, even when we are pushing an agenda in investing in those particular areas to change certain things, we need to start looking at those particular spaces and engage a little bit differently, because at certain times, we sweep certain things under the carpet. And I heard about the lady who is working with the survivors in Liberia. In Kenya, for example, we have had so many clashes, we've had so many things, but sometimes the people who come to invest sweep certain things which have happened during the cases of violence, and we never get to speak about those particular impacts on survivors of violence, particularly survivors of political violence in Kenya. We are very quiet about it, but speak about other forms of violence. But the impacts of violence for survivors who, during election clashes, there's been no response, even though it has been noted in a report, no one acts on those kind of issues. So that homogeneity and the different spaces where these things happen is something we need to talk about.
Thank you for the contributions. Now, from my view, when we are talking about lens, basically we can give it a different meaning, because the moment we are using a lens in a particular context, then perhaps ordinarily we are improving vision. And we really need to ask ourselves, what kind of new strategies and concepts do we want to visualize using these different lenses? And basically, this will help us to magnify issues which are swept under the carpet, things which are hidden, things which have never been talked about, but at the same time, they're affecting women in different spaces. So I think using the lenses will give us an opportunity to critically think about specific issues which ought to be addressed by who and in which context and environment of our work. Then it will also give us an opportunity to analytically think about how best can we address these issues in a more coordinated way and approaches which will support in terms of helping us to realize gender equality within our working environments. Then I think when we're using these lenses, we really need to engage in terms of how now do we want to use these lenses to think beyond the obvious, or think beyond our noses, so that new ideas can be able to be generated. Then we see how these new ideas can be rolled out in different contexts to suit our goal in terms of addressing gender-based violence. And I'm very happy that we are co-opting a new concept of using finance to address gender-based violence, which is very new, a very new concept in our area, but I think it's something that we really need to carry forward through a very focused and engaging discussions through different, maybe engagement partners, through different organizations, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a good opportunity to engage a gender lens perspective in terms of addressing the issues therein. Thank you.
Just to add, I think lenses, you know, as folks have said, it's a way of seeing. I also think it's deeply personal. Everyone has their own lens, or what a gender lens might mean. It comes with its own biases and expectations. And I think from what I was hearing from others, like, you know, some lenses from some individuals or organizations or institutions are overvalued, have more power, and are seen as valid compared to others, like perhaps a survivor's lens, which may be traditionally undervalued in financial circles.
Karen, did you come off mute?
I did. I was not sure. I'm always not sure if someone else is gonna unmute. I really love this discussion. You're all so rich and you're really endearing, actually. You're just all so, you know, much over the top in terms of what lens is. I thought immediately and thought when I went to Convergence in 2011 that it meant perspective taking. And that sort of rang true with the work and the writings I've done in regard to hate crime, which I was working on before. And one of the major principles of violence prevention in general, and in particular in hate crimes, is the ability to write successful programs and conduct programs and to actually be a violence prevention intervener is perspective taking, and the ability to be able to make sure that perspective goes through a variety of lenses, race, religion, ethnicity, gender. It wasn't always on the table about gender and hate crime, but it is a little more now, and we've had successful cases. But I also was thinking as I was at Convergence the last time, it's really a filter, and many of you have already talked about filter, so I won't be redundant, but the last thing I was thinking as I was coming into Convergence this time is it's really optics too. Like, how do we frame the optics of something so that someone else is going to get this and endorse us and advocate for us and expand us? And the optics are pretty important. It may seem a little shallow to talk about optics, but I really think it's important.
I've heard of, I'm sorry, Tia.
Well, I think, you know, following up on that and some of the things that everyone has said, I don't think that's shallow at all, Karen, because I don't know, a lot of people have talked about, we've talked about a lot of knowledge that we all have about how violence works, who's experiencing violence, where it fits in, but knowledge is not the same as a lens, right? I'm thinking that as you can present a set of facts, you can present the statistics, you can present, you know, the most mind-boggling statistics and stories to people. And I think that that is still not the kind of shift, I think, that we've been talking about that happens when something becomes a lens through which you then see other things. And how it seems that for certain things, I mean, I think as we think about, you know, translating some of these issues that we're talking about into seeing systems differently, or seeing how things work differently through a different lens, I do think it's worth sort of making that distinction of how do you get from one to the next? What turns knowledge into a lens through which people then see more clearly, see things differently, see things from a different perspective. That was just it coming at me, because I think often when we're trying to make a case, we think it's enough to present a set of facts, and it's not enough. That doesn't take hold as much as we might think it was. You could say, you know, this is so obvious, it's happening. Look at these numbers, look at these data, but it doesn't click.
Something that I heard a lot about was the importance of context. So different types of violence, different geographic context, layering of different types of lenses to be able to see a particular context more clearly. I'm wondering if we just look at a survivor lens, what would that look like? What would go into that? Are there different lenses that come together to make a survivor lens? What are the components of a survivor lens?
I'll start. I think that working with survivors, I feel like their the way that their lens is a lot of times in conflict with the lens of society or NGOs trying to help them, because the burden to educate society and raise awareness about violence is put on survivors. Like, you should share your story. I mean, I get that a million times, and I'm sure Easter and Shadrach, you guys get that too. We're working, you know, everyone is like, they should tell their story to protect the next group, to protect others. And, you know, it's really, that's not looking through their lens, I feel, where that's painful. It's maybe triggering and re-traumatizing. It may not, in many, or I'd say most cases, isn't right for them to share their story. That's something that's being put on them and is not seen through their lens. And the other one is like scale. You know, if you're an individual survivor, it's like, I need food, I need a place to live, I need a job. That's my lens. What I need, I've been through this terrible thing. But looking at it from a larger global philanthropy lens or impact investing lens, a lot of times it's like, well, we need to see scale. But for that individual survivor, it doesn't matter that you're helping 10,000 or 1 million survivors. I need help right now. And I think that's one way in which their lens is important and is different from what another type of lens.
Sarah, I was really struck when you shared with me why you took the enterprise that you created out of Made by Survivors and named it Releve, and how that came from the girls. And can you just share that for 1 minute?
Yeah, we've been running our enterprise for like 10 years under the name Made by Survivors, which we thought was a very empowering and hopeful name because it wasn't victim. But after you know, building up all the SEO and awareness around that, the survivors actually came to us and said, no, we don't want the first thing people see to be the worst thing that ever happened. Please change the name. And we changed it to Releve, and now it's her future coalition. But yeah, that was a way in which I thought we were being sensitive to the survivor lens, but wasn't. They didn't really actually want that to be front and center at all. So now it's very, very much in the background of, you know, if at all, in the marketing of those products.
I think one component could be, if you're to Christina's point about, you know, what are the individual lenses, surely the first thing is, how do I ensure that this doesn't happen to me again? And what are the steps that what do I need in my box to make sure that this doesn't happen? To Sarah's point, as an individual, looking through my individual perspective, what do I need to not happen?
The question for me is that when you are saying that, how do we ensure it doesn't happen again? One of the things is that, does the person have the power to get out of the environment where this is happening? Because if the person does not have that power or the agency, then they will keep on staying in that particular space. For example, we are looking at, I will refer again to the survivors of violence, which are perpetrated, particularly during political elections, for example, in Kenya, where each time you are going towards elections, violence is used to subjugate certain people, or during land clashes that is happening. So one of the things you're asking is that, in terms of the power, who actually controls the space? So one of the things is that if, for example, it is state perpetrated, for example, and you are now going against the state, how do you then ensure that we can actually then talk about a survivor who actually wants to then talk up to the state, who is in control of the judiciary, who is in control of the police, is in control of the health system, for them to be able to get justice? So in the different framings of whatever we are looking at, we have to also look at those who controls the machinery which can even address the spaces where the survivors can actually get even justice, and also even just get healing. So those kind of things. So when we are looking at that, we also look at, in terms of different framings of who then can finance spaces for well-being and healing. And this, in the context of where we work, still you have to work with the state, because they're the ones who have the resources which are then can be utilized in the spaces where we talk about the safe spaces where the survivors can go to. So in terms from the survivor's point of view, who do you go to? If the perpetrator was the state and it was perpetrated by the person who is still in the power, who controls all the systems. So that one is a challenge in spaces where we are engaging in, and it's a difficult situation and they have not gotten redress. And it's something which occurs each time. So it occurs each time we're going into elections, and each time people want to do anything, even within at the sub-national level, the state and the other people in power then utilize those finances to ensure that they can perpetrate violence, particularly always against women and girls, because it's a tool which has been used in war and it has worked to subdue people.
Other thoughts on what makes up a survivor lens? I heard a lot about power and control and really paying attention to that, thinking about prevention.
Can I bring in something else?
Of course.
Which is, well, as an investor, trying to think about the part of investing with a gender-based violence lens, which is about thinking about the survivors, working with survivors, investing in businesses that would help survivors. How often are we really getting to hear the lived experience and really understand the needs, and whose job is it to really understand and then translate the needs to the people building that financial vehicle and then selling that financial vehicle to investors? So there's a fund, an investment fund called WISH, Women in Safe Homes Fund, here in the UK, which is investing in making property investments. So it's raising money from investors to buy properties, which then would be used by NGOs that are doing housing for domestic violence survivors, for example. And then working on a grant level with those nonprofits to help them understand how to manage property effectively and how to operationalize so that the property investments actually are good investments and they get good utilization because you want stable organizations. So I found myself asking the investment team, how are you incorporating the needs of survivors into your investment process and thinking about your decision making? And they didn't even know what I was really talking. Some of them didn't really even know what I was talking about. So to me, that was like, how can I get the survivor lens into this conversation? And even knowing to ask, and then B, what's the methodology that's a good methodology? And then how do you educate not only the people building that finance tool, but then the people who'd be buying it, who'd be investing in it, to even ask that question, did you use a good process around that? So these are things that I've been thinking about in this conversation.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Maybe I weigh in briefly in terms of survival lens. My concern would be how do we ensure that the survivor of gender-based violence understands him or herself in a particular scenario where he or she lives, and most important, do they have the capacity to transit? Because someone might be a survivor, but within that particular environment where he or she is, there are still other consequences or other issues which are affecting that particular person. So in my view, it's very important that the survivor should be able to have the capacity to understand the best ways of transition to another level of understanding. And I think this is where we really need also to rope in the support system and the support structures. And this may come about as a result of maybe capacity building or awareness creation or psychosocial support and all that. Then this will now lead to a process of healing. You really need, as a survivor, to heal so that you use that lesson maybe to transit to another safe position or another safe place of survival. We have some examples, like recently we engaged with women that we're working with who are doing businesses, and a number of them are women with disabilities. So they were sharing with us some of the incidences that caused them havoc and perpetrated violence against them, particularly economic violence. So we noticed that if we look at finance critically, then finance can really help in leveraging these women to transit to another level of empowerment, where they will be able to start thinking differently and maybe redefining their lives as they cope within that particular parameter. One key area of example again would be like a woman who was selling, and all of a sudden the market where they were selling was closed because of COVID, and she had to retreat back to her house where she lives and take back the goods to her house. Now she cannot sell as she used to because she's only selling a little stock on a daily basis, which is not enough for survival. So looking at this, if we such as survivor or such a woman would be supported or to access economic empowerment opportunities, then it means that that person will be able to transit without any difficulties or more stress to a safer space, and also maybe start thinking about new ideologies can help us. Which can help her to survive within the context of violence. So in our view, I think it's about sustainability of the survival process. Because if you survive and you don't have the means to transit within that survival process, then again, it comes back to you. It may even relapse, and that process of survival may not make a lot of meaning if you don't get out of it appropriately. Thank you.
Could look into what Shadrach has just said, because in the context during COVID, one of the challenges that women with disability face is that the spaces where they can even work, which then protects them from economic violence, is also something which then we need to look at, right? So in that context, we are looking at how to ensure that when we're dealing with the issues of economic injustice through the economic violence, which was meted against some of them in their market spaces, it means that they were removed from their spaces of work because that there were COVID restrictions. So now they do not have work. It means that one, they are still now in spaces where, apart from just facing the violence within their households, now the issues of economic injustice comes in. But one of the challenges which is then faced, that whilst investing in those particular areas where they're going to be relocated, the government has totally forgotten that there are different disabilities. So one of the things that is being done is that they will always put a ramp, which will then be suitable only for one type of disability. So those kind of things is that when we are looking at even, that's why when you're looking at even investing in these particular spaces and looking at that lens, the disability lens means that how do we then ensure that the state is also then able to design spaces which can prevent economic violence and exclusion for those particular kind of women who need resources. And some of these resources actually come from different places who finance. For example, those markets, I think, are designed by World Bank, for example. So even when World Bank is giving money, how do we then ensure that the World Bank is also thinking of those kind of people, or even elderly people, and even women with children, who then need to use those particular spaces because they work in those particular areas? So in one of the questions we have asked, for example, in Kenya, is to ask them to redesign the markets, to ensure that the markets have creches so that women who are working in the marketplaces can have places where their children can actually work. So then it reduces the issues of, one, the gender-based violence, which is faced that you went to work and you left your child at home, those kind of issues, because of the patriarchal nature of certain societies, we then think that the work of looking after children is only for women. So the unpaid care work for women is also something we need to look at. So when we look at unpaid care work for women who have, it's not even triple roles. I think there are 10 roles which women are actually doing within those particular spaces. Then we'll then engage in those particular spaces. And then finally, for me, using in terms of the survivors, ensuring that these spaces, even when they work, are actually safe. We work in an area where we are looking at issues of public transport, that when women are looking at where you come from and the way the roads are designed for women, that in terms of that, many women who come from work have actually faced a lot of violence on their way from work or on their way to work. So in terms of the survival lens, we are looking at how are structural designs of roads, workplaces, are able to address those particular issues so that you don't have to face an issue in the household, you face an issue in the workplace, and you face issues to and from work. So in those bits, it's both in private and public spaces that survivors need to be taken care of. And this can only be addressed by how we finance the structural designs of where these people are engaged.
I've heard lots of comments kind of moving to how do we actually apply a survivor lens to finance investments in different sectors, different industries. I want, before we move there, I really want to dig in on this question of us, what makes a survivor lens? I keep hearing, you know, the ability to get out of a situation of violence as being core to that. And that raises this question for me of when do we use a survivor lens specifically, and how is that distinct from a broader gender-based violence lens or a prevention lens, which might come into play at a different level and apply to people who may not have experienced violence? Any thoughts on that distinction?
In what context, Christina, do you mean when, sorry, can you just kind of walk me through that again?
I think that's my question to you, because
okay.
it's so important. What are the contexts in which you would apply, you would start with that survivor lens, or you would apply a survivor lens as opposed to maybe it's a prevention lens or a broader gender lens or a broader gender-based violence lens?
I mean, can I just, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're looking for, but to Easter's point, you know, there are sort of two parts to this, but one of the sort of key things in the 30 years I've been doing this is I feel sort of terribly naive in many respects that I looked at, it's never occurred to me to assume that I would know what, I see my only role as being to get more money into the hands of women and girls that need it. And obviously they're the ones telling me what they need to do with it. So, so in the last 6 months, all we've been trying to do is get cash out to the women that we work with. And, you know, I set up Western Union because that was the quickest way to get it to them. And even if it's $1,000 at a time, you know, that's what they need within their groups. So to Easter's point that, you know, you need something immediate and quick and what they need, which is to feed their children when they can't get out of their houses and they're being abused. But sort of to your point about that then pulls you back from the perspective of how do you get more women into local government, national government, international government, so that you have possibly survivors of violence who are in the systems that can then change the systems. Again, to Easter's earlier point, which is you're not going to report something that, you know, to a system that's perpetrating the activity. So again, that's one of the reasons why we work in this 5 key framework. But the peace and security aspect of that is, you know, how do you train? We're doing a training with some women in the DRC. Obviously, you know, they've been involved in this for a long time. But so I think, I'm not sure that really answers your question, but that's kind of how I think of it, is how do you do the immediate, I need food on my table, I need to get away from this situation, and then kind of what's the big perspective of leaving the Colosseum and sort of looking back and going, okay, and for the long term, how do we get more people who understand this within the systems to change it?
I also think that it's important that we consider the voices of the survivors whenever we are undertaking our approaches in different ways, because if we don't create spaces for allowing the participation and the voices of the survivors to be captured, then it means we'll be programming for them or planning for them, and we may be able to miss out on very critical aspects of needs that need to be that should be addressed as a result of our interventions on gender-based violence. So in my view, it is just important that as different organizations, we consider engagement of survivors right from planning to design to implementation and to monitoring, so that it's a seamless process that mainstreams their voices in the entire intervention cycle. And with that approach, I want to believe that using survivor lens in the broader context of the lens of gender-based violence, or implementing programs of gender-based violence from a survivor lens would be able to be realized effectively. So for me, I would want to say that when they are effectively engaged, when they inform or they bring up issues which inform the programming, then it means that we have effectively engaged and ensured that specific issues which are affecting them are taken care of. Yes.
My question is, in terms of the sustainability of some of the, one of the things in the looking at the survivor lens is the sustainability of certain interventions which are done. Because one of the things is that in terms of the way we program, along the way back, you used to have like 5-year programs which would be able to do a short, a mid-term and a longer term planning in terms of engagement. So one of the things we are looking at, even within our own particular spaces and where we want to intervene, for example, with government, how consistent are we in terms of looping into their plans? And for me, who believes in feminist disrupting certain things which then ensure that survivors never get to have their voices within those contexts. So how are we creating spaces to disrupt the norm so that survivors can actually get to speak within those particular spaces? We have all these technical spaces where we talk about technical working groups, all these other spaces where you have to know how to cross your T's and your I's. But some of these survivors do not have such kind of language. So thinking about that, how do we then start ensuring that we get survivors to become they speak about their own narrative, can tell their own stories. So using different frameworks, like for example, we use forum theater for communication to be able to speak about those narratives, writing so that they're able to write about their own stories. So if you're able to create some of those spaces, I think then survivors will be able to speak about their own experiences and the journey it takes them to get either out, or sometimes, unfortunately, people keep on going back because there are no structures which then can help them get out of the system. One of the challenges that we are facing even in Kenya is, for example, on the issue of lack of investment even on mental health. So even when you want to go for even psychosocial support, it doesn't exist in public spaces. So even when somebody needs psychosocial support, how does this survivor then be able to access those particular spaces? And if those spaces don't exist, how do we then work with investors to actually then invest in spaces which then also talks about mental health for survivors?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm struck by with all of this is, we've been talking about this idea of a survivor lens, and in the last hour, we've named so many different angles of how a survivor's experience is different in a multitude of ways. Someone who is a survivor and has a certain type of disability, the cultural context in which they're operating, the type of violence that they've experienced. And I think, I mean, I don't know if this was getting to Christina's question, but what is the, I guess, how do you create a survivor lens that all of us can sort of advocate for, to be a part of financial analysis, how businesses come up with policies, how anyone is coming up with policies and designs, how do you kind of have that with, in a way that, you know, while kind of still holding the complexity of people's experiences and how different they are? What is the, I mean, I know that Suzanne, I think this is something that, you know, you and Joy and everyone working in gender lens investing has also wrestled with, you know, what is, you don't want to do kind of 5 easy things because that's not getting to everyone's experience, but how do you move down that path? How do you move these systems and institutions down that path while not, you know, dishonoring and disempowering and further marginalizing certain people? And I'm wondering if that's what one of the things we're trying to get to, at least with the applicability of a survivor lens. What is an applicable survivor lens?
So it makes me think, are there types? Are there like archetypes, right? And some of this is like from learning from Sarah Simmons about her organization, because I spent more time looking at what they were doing in the jewelry business. And because I've been scanning this from an investment standpoint, if there is, you know, the characteristic of the survivor who is even more resilient and even better an employee because they've gotten through so much and they're extraordinary, like they'd be the best person that you'd want to pick. That's sort of a type compared to another type, which might be people who have a lot of issues, multiple barriers still, that you need to build in extra things to be sensitive to their needs and to educate the other people working with them to be sensitive to their needs. Like that's another type. Or people who have a specific need, like they need housing. They need safe housing as like a specific need, right? And I just wonder if there's, and without oversimplifying, because we don't, to your point, we don't want to do that, but are there things that would help those who are not deeply in the work, as so many of you are, shortcut on a certain, and it's I hesitate to even say shortcut, but just understand this better. So if you knew like, these are the archetypes, or these are the types of things that you might be thinking of, and here's how to get a gate. Like when you're looking at this investment, what is this investment trying to solve for? And where's the data that supports that? To help us understand how to do that.
Right. And I'm thinking even of, you know, not simple, but examples, sort of specific examples, like we know that financial abuse is you know, happens in almost every case of intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And there are just simple things, I think, that if, say, financial institutions understood about what people who are experiencing or have experienced financial abuse are going through, there are kind of fairly simple, I think, adjustments to kind of the ways in which you interact with your consumer base that could actually, you know, both benefit the survivor and also actually benefit the financial institution, and that there's just kind of a mismatch of understanding of where people are and what the barriers they're facing are. And that, I mean, in my mind, that's kind of the one version of a survivor lens where it kind of, you know, a different understanding of needs just sort of shifts how you interact with people. But that's not, you know, that's not the entirety, and that's a very specific instance.
I think it would be really cool to convene survivors from different contexts and different countries, and, you know, kind of put together a panel of survivors who together defines for us all what are the needs, you know, across contexts, what they really care about, what they really want, and then let that kind of think tank inform everything from there on. But I would love it if such a convening or panel didn't require people to publicly identify as a survivor, especially if we're talking about sexual violence, because it seems like the voices, you know, you hear are those brave individuals who have chosen to speak out, you know, and identify themselves publicly. But there's lots of others who aren't ready to do that, or will never be right to do that, whose voices also need to be heard. You know, I don't know if anyone's really tried it, but like a kind of a conference or virtual convening of survivors that is, their identity is private to them, and they know who each other are, but not in the whole world doesn't. And then they're, you know, be spokespeople who could share that lens and you know, I flatter myself that I have a pretty good idea of what survivors need because I ask them all the time, but still, you know, to actually them to be the ones that define it would be transformational of the space.
Well, ironically, given Zoom's ability to where you could have a different mask your identity and mask your face, this is like the perfect moment to ironically to be able to do that.
Really interesting. Take advantage of how we're all convening now. Yeah, I just put a link in the chat there. There's a new organization that's called the Survivors Agenda that is, I don't know if people are involved with it, but that seems to be trying to do just this, kind of get survivors' perspectives on how they want all sorts of different systems and institutions and response and everything to work. I've only just started looking into it, and I think it's in early stages, but yeah, Sarah, I think that seems to be where we're coming to, right? There's so many different kind of needs and issues that people are facing. Can we sort of map them, and then can we see how they then map onto things like financial decision-making, opportunity, risk, where the kind of links, and where is there an analysis that needs to shift?
Yes, thank you. I think it's important that we really need to ground a survivor-led approach to addressing gender-based violence in our workspaces. And it starts with us. And looking at this, I think internally we need to look at our strategic planning processes so that in our strategic plans, we have a very deliberate pillar, which is resourced in terms of addressing GBV and working with survivors of gender-based violence. Once this is done, then we'll be having like a long-term plan that can be monitored and tracked to ensure that we kind of harvest results and check on progress and challenges, which we can review continuously as we continue to engage. Then I think another key area which is very important in our organization is the area of policy influencing. Like Esther mentioned earlier in her presentation, that there could be challenges arising from maybe the government or the right hold, the duty bearers. I think it is important that we really sharpen our focus in terms of initiating policy discussions, policy documentations, and policy engagements, which would be able to influence those who are in power to start thinking transformatively in terms of how best can they adopt programs which are addressing gender-based violence. In the Kenyan context, we have a devolved government, and it's the responsibility of the national government to give the devolved government money to ensure that they initiate development processes. Even though it may not be enough, but it is important that we fast track and ensure that we monitor how these monies are spent, and we can lobby with the county government so that they deliberately set aside resources that will be able to support in addressing gender-based violence, so that we all work together towards achieving one same goal. As NGOs, we do our part, then we work collaboratively with the county government so that we pool those efforts, and basically we'll be able to realize a more focused the survivor, the GBV survivor lens kind of approach in addressing gender-based violence in our organizations and the communities that we work with. Thank you.
In looping to what Shadrach is saying is that in terms of the policy framework and in the financing must go beyond just the medical bit, because in terms of some of the survivors, one of the things which happens is that once you've gotten out of the facility and maybe you have gone through the referral pathway where you even get to court in terms of justice systems, one of the challenges which survivors have is sustaining themselves during the process. Because for the survivor, why they sometimes even give up on the cases is that it takes so long, the court process can take so long. So you can compromise because you'd rather withdraw the case and get some money to survive. So, and that means that how are we investing in certain things which then can ensure that whilst a survivor is going through the process of getting both social and legal justice, then they're still able to then do something. So we can then invest in these particular spaces, which then can give them something to do and even survive. Because if you look at the survivors of gender-based, like domestic violence or intimate partner violence within those particular spaces, you still have to go back to those particular areas. And if you are not working, for example, then if you don't have a job, then it is an issue which is a challenge. In places where we don't have shelters, for example, where we are still pushing to have shelters and safe houses where somebody can even go for reprieve, then it still means that you still go back to that same space where the perpetrator is. And then when there are all these cultural issues where we are told not to shame your community, it still goes back to how the socialization of the people who we talk to as survivors. So what is our socialization and the cultural context is still going to be very critical in engaging survivors to be able to then start taking up the mantle to ensure that they can then do certain things to get out of the challenges that they have.
So we feel like we're only just starting to dig in, but we have only 10 minutes left. So we usually end these with a reflection. Can everyone hear me still? Okay, sorry, my screen went.
You're back.
Okay, great. We usually end with a reflection. I'm wondering if, in addition to a reflection, if we want to name, what is the thing that you want to think about next coming out of this conversation? I mean, we didn't even get to we only started to get to the how and the so what of having a survivor lens on things like opportunity and risk. So what is this, I guess, in addition to a reflection, what does this spark for you, and what's the thing that you want to think about next, or have a conversation with someone else on this call or someone else that you know next from this? Anyone can jump in, or we'll go around.
So my brain goes straight to, I think somebody called it, or the way I think of it is a framework, but somebody mentioned sort of these different angles of prevention, intervention, and we were talking about the difference between a survivor lens and a broader GBV lens. I think, what would it look like to have this framework of what are those different lenses? How do they fit together? How do you apply them in different contexts? What's the way to customize them, like ensuring that you have survivor voices in that, what's the kind of guidebook you could put together for investors? And maybe it's kind of a combination of things like Criterion's process metrics is part of it, or just sort of a framing about the language and the different views. And it's really clear that there is so much knowledge and data out there. And how do we kind of bring that together in a way that also allows for that contextualization in different places?
Yeah, I can try and build on that. I really did like this vision or idea around a continuum at the journey that a survivor takes, the supports that they might need along the way, and recognizing that they're embedded in a system that may be supporting them or the reverse. And again, I kind of jumped to like practical things, so I think I'll enjoy the subsequent sessions, but I've really appreciated hearing. I mean, one thing for me that I'll think about a lot is like centering survivors. How do we center survivors in everything we do? And with this continuum, I think what would be really interesting as like a next step from, if we understand some pathways of what a survivor's journey looks like, honoring the contextual specificity of what they're going through, what kinds of methods from, and predominantly I'm thinking from an investor or business executive perspective, what kinds of things might they consider that would play into that continuum, whether that's, I think someone mentioned like internal operations of our own organizations is a good place to start, right? And then I heard from some, like in terms of grant capital being needed when the emergencies are so, you know, there is an urgent need to address the survivors' needs versus investments that may be more needed at a different point in the continuum. I think there's also a huge, and Criterion, your due diligence guide is amazing about, I think, engagement. How are we asking questions and engaging as shareholders? And also recognizing our role in industry advocacy. So I'm really kind of excited to think about those pieces as well, but always tying it back to how do we remain accountable to the survivors?
I always like to go back to the root causes. And so I guess my reflection, this has been an excellent conversation, is sort of really about domination and power, and almost like kind of flipping the telescope, right? So you're looking at it through the other end. You know, kind of what are those power structures, and why does this happen over and over again in so many forms, in so many different ways? Perhaps sort of just trying to get deeper into that, of the why of it. And obviously that's a hugely complex, but almost to not look at it, not go towards that. You know, we need to kind of drill deeper, I think. I think that's my reflection.
Back to that reflection. I'm trained as a theologian, and in my field, we'd call this a hermeneutic, the lens, and looking at theology through a survivor lens has already been happening in my field, but maybe a little bit less so among actual spiritual community leaders. So in the Christian tradition, pastors. So the question I want to think about is, and I had to write it out, so that's why, for me at least, I was very quiet at the question. I had to write it. What relationship is there between finances and symbolic systems and beliefs? So what's the relationship between those two, and who's responsible for what in the interface of our symbolic systems and global finance or local finance?
Well, I, like Devin, like action steps and concrete actions. Not very theoretical at all. I'd love to see coming out of this, like working together with some of you guys and survivors in our different organizations on either a white paper or a framework, or like, it doesn't have to be like this giant book about it, but, you know, getting started on writing a survivor lens framework, methodologies for investors and grant makers and, you know, and individual NGOs to kind of share as widely as possible and like get that out there as at least a starting point of this is a survivor lens and here it is, use it.
And Sarah, to build on what you said, I think the thing I'm taking away, coming from a totally different field, more marketing experiences, taking ideas and shining a light on it for masses, I'm taking away, how do you effectively, respectfully, and accurately, you said the personal needs of the individual versus the public need for awareness. How can you wrestle with both sides of that as you try to have hopefully an increase in mass action towards this issue, but also not taking more from survivors? I'm going to wrestle with that idea for a while.
I think also there are people.
But it's fine. But now I'm very much excited because I've really learned a lot, and we have really had some gaps in terms of ensuring that we mainstream our programs from survivors' lens, and using the lens of survivor to design our projects and program interventions would really guarantee a very good results in our work. So I think it's something which I'm really taking home. It's a good lesson for us. And moving forward as our organization, Ability Africa Foundation, some of the best.
Shadrach, you're cutting out.
Yeah, he was having connection.
Yeah.
A little while ago. Suzanne, I know you were trying to say something. Should we go ahead and
Yeah, no, I'm also thinking about if we just have some way to easily say for an investment opportunity that is directly about prevention or root causes or specific prevention or supporting survivors or sometimes people will say to me when I say, hey, have you looked at this self-defense company to invest in? They've said, yeah, don't talk to me about that. We need to be working on root causes. Or if I've said, I want to, have you looked at this housing property fund for survivors? They've said, oh, don't talk to me about that. We need to look at prevention. And so just also something that would say, here's the continuum. Here are investment opportunities or investment needs and solutions across these different things. And they all are necessary and they all fit together in this particular way. And strategically, if we want to address this, you'd be looking across the continuum, just like you would in so many other areas of investment and saying, yeah, any social issue that we want to solve for, we need to be looking holistically and then deciding where the investments make the most sense. And by the way, where they don't. And unfortunately, there are people who then present things as if they're a solution to something when they're really not, right? And because you don't have the voice of the people who are closest to it, investors who don't know any better will say, oh, I should put my money there because some seemingly credible person is behind it. I mean, it happens in philanthropy too, right? So just that's what I'm taking away, is just wanting to operationalize this. I share that, that desire with Sarah and some of the others.
I know we're at time, but I would love to hear from Karen, Kalia, Easter.
What I'm taking away, we have a whole lot of work to do to ensure agency of the survivor and to ensure the issues of intersectionality is included in terms of the survivor. And it means that we need to really come together to start actually looking at developing frameworks which then are more inclusive of diversity, so that the different survivors are able to then have their needs actually addressed. Because otherwise then we are still going to address it through a more homogeneous form of way, which then does not necessarily address the persons who then we are actually engaging with. So for me, back to the drawing board to ensure that one, we are actually then engaging on speaking with and not for survivors. Thank you.
Anybody else want to? I mean, people don't have to, but I know that my mind was going in a similar place to Sarah's and Suzanne. How can, it won't be perfect, but how can we start to operationalize this? Is this a framework? Is it a white paper? Is it a set of principles? What can we pull out of this that centers survivors' voices and needs, and also kind of puts them in something that we might be able to put into action? Kalia or Karen, and we don't have to, we can just wrap this up. Oh, Karen, you're on mute.
There are typologies and there are frameworks that might assist us. I share Sarah's concern about trying to do more with the real live voices of survivors that I want to just also say they're all among us because of the pervasiveness of this issue. And also there's many people who have trauma in their lives that are very parallel to what gender-based violence, and they're all among us too. So their voices are really critical, and you're hearing them a lot of the time. And to Sarah's point, they're maybe not out about it. So we can rest assured when we bring in more people, we already have some that are, I think, the font of wisdom. The last thing I'll just say is there's been a lot of work early on in all of our fields, before there were rape crisis centers and before there were domestic violence shelters, that really emphasized issues of second injury. And not to get terribly theoretical, Sarah, but one of the things that I think is very important is that people learn this very easy concept because it's within institutions, it's within our norms and societies in general, and it's in individual persons. And when they understand you can do things to combat it, this represents ongoing pernicious barriers for victims that we can all have the language to help. And I think that might be a really good framework to look at, and the typologies of both prevention and the typologies of types of victims under gender issues in general, gender crimes in general. So I leave you with that mouthful. I'm sorry to say it all at the end.
I think that I know people have to jump and we're well over. So thank you so much, everyone. I am sure that a lot of these will come back up over the course of conversations. And in the meantime, there is Workplace where we have circles and ways to connect, and we should just keep this going. You know, this question of a survivor lens and survivor voices centered in all of these, all of the things that we're working on. So thank you, and we'll speak to you all soon. Have a lovely day.
Get to do this.